Ricardo Hausmann is the founder and director of Harvard's Growth Lab and the Rafik Hariri Professor of the Practice of International Political Economy at Harvard Kennedy School. He also served as Minister of Planning of Venezuela between 1992 and 1993, and as a member of the board of the Central Bank of Venezuela. In other words, he's an expert on Venezuela, and that's what we'll be talking about today. Welcome, Ricardo.
Well, thank you very much for this invitation, and thank you for putting attention to Venezuela. It's a very important situation and a very important country.
Ricardo, you recently wrote on Twitter, which I guess we're all calling X, on the Venezuelan elections. Two obvious facts. First, the opposition won by a landslide of over 30% points difference. And second, the government has decided to steal the result. Would you care to elaborate?
Well, I wrote that at about midnight on Sunday between July 28th and July 29th, right? So it was clear that the opposition was winning the election because of exit polls, because of the first quick counts that we were doing. And I was being conservative because it ended up being more like 37 points than 30 points. And the second thing is that the government suddenly announced that they had won, right? And they did so. They kind of like planned to steal the election in the most in-your-face, incompetent manner you could possibly imagine. And as a consequence, since July 28th, things have just become more and more obvious, of some more and more clarity on how shallow was justifying a Maduro victory in that election. So I think that we're living in that world, a world in which we have discovered that there's an incredible new political majority in Venezuela that is incredibly homogeneous across all states of the country. So it's not like they're red states and blue states. They're all voted. In all of them, the opposition won. Rich areas, poor areas, urban areas, rural areas. It's an amazing unification, if you want, political unification of the country. And the second thing that has happened since is this incredible metastasis of what was initially, if you want, a conspiracy that involved the Electoral Council to a conspiracy that involves more and more of the institutions of government.
Could you explain that?
Well, the Electoral Council announced results that were not the popular will. They announced invented results. They did so incompetently that the numbers that they announced were 51.20000% for Maduro and 41.20000% for. So it's obvious that these are made up numbers. They would never emerge from a natural process. But so it was the Electoral Council, right? But immediately you have the Minister of Defense with a high military command backing this whole thing. And then they also announced that there was a cyber attack on their systems, which was the reason why they couldn't publish the results. And so the Attorney General starts proceedings for the people who conspired with apparently North Macedonia to do this cyber attack, right? So now it's the Attorney General that is involved. Then they go to the Supreme Court. Supposedly, you complain to the Supreme Court because of something that somebody did that you disagree with. But here is Maduro asking the Supreme Court to decide on the thing that the Electoral Council has decided. Well, he has nothing to complain about because the Electoral Council said he won. So now it's a conspiracy that involves the Supreme Court. So it's all the institutions of government that are involved in this attempt to steal the election and to violate the decision of the people.
Why have bothered to have elections in the first place?
Well, that's a very interesting and deep question. In the world today, even dictators want to say that they won elections. Let's remember that the German Democratic Republic was not democratic, but they had democratic in their names, no? So democracy is a form of legitimacy. Elections are a form of legitimacy. So in Maduro's first best, he was going to organize an election that he would win, and then the world would acknowledge that he won, and the world would recognize him, something that the world has not done since 2018 when he stole the last election. So he thought that he could steal this election in a less grotesque manner. So following what Professor Steve Levitsky would have advised, no, not that he's in this advising business, but this is his analysis of how dictators steal elections, that you want to steal the election before election day. You want to make sure that once you get to the election day, it's obvious that you're going to win. So Maduro had a really, really good plan. He was going to impede the opposition from holding a primary. He was going to, which he tried to do, and the Electoral Council did not authorize that primary and did not help in that primary. The primary happened because civil society organized the primary, and Maria Corina Machado won the primary by a landslide. So he said to himself, okay, no problem. So now the opposition has, a part of the opposition has unified behind a single strong candidate. So what I need to do is very simple. I need to prohibit that candidate from participating in the election and then register 15 other people who I'm going to kind of like corrupt in order to run for elections. In order for them to be somewhat known, I'm going to help them steal the symbols of the political parties that they kind of belong to. So they expropriated from the parties their symbols and gave it to people in those parties that would be that were in cahoots with the government. So they allowed a bunch of candidates. Among them, they allowed Edmundo González Urrutia, which they allowed him in because, it's an unknown, diplomat in his 70s, never had a political career, etc. Very decent man, a very respected man, but not known nationally. I personally did not know him, right? And they would have thought that by prohibiting Maria Corina Machado to run, that she would call to boycott the elections. And if she calls to boycott the elections, then the opposition would not have voted in the elections. Maduro would have won the election by a landslide, and then that was it, right? But it just so happens that Maria Corina decided to endorse Edmundo González. And so they decided, okay, let's make it impossible for them to organize a campaign. Let's put in jail the team that organizes and runs the campaign. They put in jail a couple of them, but 5 of them sought asylum at the Argentine embassy. And they kept on running the campaign from the Argentine embassy. Okay. So then they said, okay, so we won't allow them to get on airplanes. So they'll have to move by land, and we will block the roads. So they won't be able to get there. And once they get there, we will organize parallel meetings in those days, and we will have our violent groups, trying to create fear or panic for people not to participate in those events. In the end, all of these things made the electoral campaign of Edmundo and Maria Corina that much more epic. And it became an expression of freedom, of revolt, of dream, of aspiration. So he thought, okay, this didn't go as planned, so let me go to the election, and since I'll trick the results so that I win. Okay, so he tricked the results and announced that he won, right? But he did not know that there were tens of thousands of people organized to collect the printouts of all the electoral machines and all the kind of administrative backup of what happened in every precinct. And within less than 24 hours, collect them all, sum them up, and announce them to the public, something that he was not letting the Electoral Council do, because if the Electoral Council had shown these things, he would have shown that he lost. So I would say he did a lot to win the election the way dictators win elections, but they were incompetent in the process of doing it, and the opposition and the political will behind the opposition and the intelligence of the opposition, caught him by surprise.
Uh-huh. So, but you've had in Venezuela, you mentioned 2018, you've had opposition before, you've had people on the streets before. This has been going on for almost 25 years. So, how does this new crisis change things, Ricardo?
Well, what happened in 2018, by the way, it's important that I mention, there were supposed to be elections in October 2018. What Maduro did is he switched them to May in March. He switched them to May, not giving the opposition any chance to organize themselves. And then he outlawed a bunch of political parties. So the political parties said, we're not participate. So he won that election because the rest did not participate, but the rest convinced the world that this was a sham election. And by the world, I mean like 60 some countries, including the US, Europe, Japan, Latin America, etc., did not recognize that election. So Maduro has suffered from lack of international recognition since 2018. This time, it's just more in your face. Kind of, it's not just that we did not participate, and if had we participated, who the hell knows what would have happened, right? But this time, we participated, and he lost 70-30. So now we know who won, etc. In an election that, even though it was unfair, the results, by the way, it was even more unfair that some 5 million people were not allowed to vote, including me, right? According to the Constitution, I should have had the right to vote abroad, but Maduro did not let, except for a symbolic number of people, to vote abroad. That is sort of like a continuation, but of the illegitimacy of this government, but in a way that is much more powerful this time around. And there's much more of a unified country this time around. Now, what's on the table is whether in the 21st century you can have a dictatorship in opposition to the great majority of the citizens of that country. And that's something we haven't seen. I mean, Pinochet was in power for 17 years or so, for how many? About 17 years, but he was never as unpopular as Maduro is now. So he had more of a political base. So we don't know how these things end, but I would say, let me use this metaphor. This regime suffers from cancer, okay? And the cancer has been growing. Now, when people die with cancer, they don't die directly from cancer. They die from some complication caused by the cancer. It might be respiratory insufficiency, it might be, something else, right? So it might be, weakening of the immune system, so they die from an infection. So they die from some complication caused by the weakening that the cancer has produced. Oftentimes, it's unpredictable. You can predict that the patient is going to die, but you don't know exactly what's the complication that's going to kill the patient. I feel that way about this regime. The cancer has grown enormously. It has metastasized, etc. It weakens the whole governance structure, the whole legitimacy of the thing. That is bound to generate complications. And this regime is going to die from one of those complications. But it's hard to pinpoint ex ante what is the complication that will kill it.
Wow, that's a great analogy. You mentioned the fact that many countries did not recognize the 2018 election. What should the international community do about Venezuela, and what has it done thus far?
So let's start with what it has done, right? Obviously, the international community does not, in this language, does not include China, Russia, Cuba, Nicaragua, Iran, Turkey. Those have all recognized Maduro, okay? But everybody else has not, okay? So that means not only the US, Canada, the European Union, but the left-wing governments of Latin America, including Chile's Boric, including Lula, including Petro in Colombia, including AMLO in Mexico. So they have said, we cannot recognize the elections until we see the results. You have to publish these actas, these printouts of the results precinct by precinct. Otherwise, we cannot recognize that election. That is sort of like the minimum of the positions taken by countries, including Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico. Chile, who's also a very left-wing government, has taken a different stand. They've said, we know who won. Edmundo González won. They are stealing this election. They are violating human rights. They're putting people in jail, and they're criminalizing things that are not crimes anywhere else in a democratic country. As a consequence, we are not going to recognize the results of this election, not until the Electoral Council does X or Y, because the Electoral Council is complicit in the steal. So we don't trust those institutions. They all seem to be corrupted. We're not going to recognize this government until an international organization comes in and looks at the situation and tells us, okay? So that is a very left-wing government saying that that's the position of President Boric, which is remarkably similar to the position taken by the president of Argentina. They are at the political polar opposites in traditional parlance, but they're both democratic. The question is, are you a democracy? Are you for democracy, or are you not? Okay, so that's a position taken by them. I think that one of the things that is happening right now is that everybody has decided to let Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia try out a solution, lead a process. So everybody's waiting for these three countries, which are the closest ideologically to Maduro, to see if they can work something out with the government. I don't think that the world is going to let them have that leadership role forever. So it's sort of like it's a temporary assignment of leadership. But if they don't come up with something soon, I think they will stop being players.
Mm-hmm. Do you think a negotiated solution is possible?
I mean, any scenario would involve a negotiation at some point in time, right? Even, when in a regular government, somebody wins an election from the opposite party, so you have the transition teams. And in this case, it's going to be more complicated because it's the transition between regimes, if you want. In the past, we've seen cases, for example, there was a negotiation of the transition in Chile between Pinochet and President Elwin. And in that transition, Pinochet was left as half of the army, right? So he was left in a role. So there could be a lot of things to negotiate. In particular, this is just a presidential election. It was not an election of the National Assembly. The National Assembly controls the Supreme Court appointments. It appoints the Attorney General. It appoints the Controller General. So had they just accepted the results, there would have been a transfer of power in the presidency. Maduro would have kept control over a lot of the state. But now all of that part of the state is involved in a conspiracy to perform a coup d'etat. So that complicates the transition. And it would have to be negotiated how it is that we're going to solve this situation. Because, if somebody steals money, the problem is not just solved by the thief returning the money, because now you have to do something with the thief, right? There was a crime that has been committed. So it's not, you committed a crime, no, well, return the money, but you stay where you are. No. There is a problem. Obviously, there can never be, again, an election in Venezuela organized by this electoral council. It is unthinkable, right? That these guys that have performed this crime in front of the world that they would be allowed to organize another election. So we would need to negotiate a new electoral council. We would need to negotiate a new attorney general that is performing right now gross violations of human rights, putting thousands of people in jail for no reason. So there's a lot to negotiate. There's a lot to negotiate. The question is, but the government has, and by the way, Maria Corina Machado has called for negotiations for many, many months. And the government has said, we have nothing to negotiate with you. And so, but at some point, there will have to be a negotiation to transfer power, to assign power, to solve many, many problems associated with the transition.
What about the demonstrations, Ricardo? Do they matter?
I think the demonstrations matter a lot because they show commitment. They're an indication that it's a society that will not be ruled without its consent. You know, the consent of the people is supposedly to be the basis of power. Well, there is no consent. And the demonstrations are a way of reminding the world that there is no consent, and to remind each other, and to remind each other of each other's resolve to not provide that consent. So I think they are an important thing. They're important for the army and the police to know that they were supposed to have a decent job, you know, designed to protect people. But now for the same salary, they are asked to repress people. They are asked to violate the Constitution and the laws to repress people. And it's not obvious that they signed up for that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the more the government tries to just repress people, the more they have to rely on institutions that may not see that as part of a contract.
Okay. Well, some people say that the only way the Maduro government will leave its autocratic rule is if there's a split in the armed forces. What do you think about that?
That's why I say that, you know, you die from some complications of the cancer. In the case of Bolivia, with Evo Morales, he stole an election. It was enough for the police to say you have to go, that he went, right? So it's when you need to use parts of the state to stay in power, and those parts of the state realize it doesn't make sense for them to violate the law, to put themselves in legal danger, in constitutional danger, be sanctioned by the world, to be liable for crimes against humanity and so on, just to protect a president that has lost an election, right? So yes, some breaks of that kind tend to happen in these situations, and they often tend to snowball.
Mm-hmm.
Like right now, one of the things that is happening is that some of those candidates that were, in some sense, allowed to run to provide justification for the legitimacy of Maduro's victory, well, they're now acting up. They're now saying, no, this was a sham. This was stolen. So if you look at Enrique Marquez's statements and other people, they're now Claudio Fermin even. He immediately, Claudio Fermin came out and immediately recognized Maduro's victory, but now he's backtracking.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people who have information about what happened inside. They say, no, this, and they have stood up. So suddenly, people who were supposed to play a role in the whole legitimacy process are realizing that it's not in their interest to keep on playing that role. And that's how you see breakups. But, and by the way, let me tell you something that also happened. On Sunday, July 28th, the day of the election, all the precincts, all the electoral precincts were, as they are in every occasion in Venezuela, under the control of the military. There's something called Plan República. At some point in time, when they had to count the votes, it's obviously done by a machine and so on, they received the order to kick out the opposition witnesses and to not allow the machines to to add up the votes and to print out the results and to transmit the results. They didn't want that to happen. And there was an effort by military people who are retired and so on to be in touch with those military in control of these electoral precincts to say, follow the law, follow the law, follow the law. So, and in the end, they followed the law. They didn't follow the orders. They followed the law. And that's why we got 83% of the precincts reporting. But the intent was for that not to happen. But it happened because the military followed the law.
Uh-huh.
Okay? By the way, in many of the precincts where essentially only the military vote, Maduro lost by a landslide in the same way as he lost everywhere else. So now the government realizes, hey, in all of these military precincts, they are not with me. So we need to look at these guys. We need to, monitor these guys. We may need to imprison these guys because they're obviously not with us. There is a video today of the governor of the state of Trujillo. The state of Trujillo is a fairly poor state, an Andean state in the west of the country. In front of a gathering, he says that he's going to fire anybody because now he realizes that a bunch of people that are working for him voted for the opposition. He says that they are going to fire everybody who didn't vote for them, that they're going to prohibit trucks from sending food to Caracas because let Caracas starve because they didn't vote for the revolution. And so they're, going crazy, right? In their worldview, the good is the revolution, and those who did not vote for the revolution are traitors, are enemies, are unacceptable, right? And you are entitled to do anything you want to them. Okay, that came as a real shocker. That now they are in some sense Senator Waltz would call weird. They are acting weird. They are acting really, really weird.
One last question. Before the election, a lot of people, as reported, were saying that if the opposition didn't win or if their win wasn't respected, that they had their suitcases packed, that they were going to leave. And many people were talking about, oh, there's going to be a second wave of a third wave or whatever it is of Venezuelans who are voting with their feet. Do you see any evidence that is happening? Do you feel that people have changed their mind? What is your sense about possible immigration?
Well, around 8 million people have left the country in the last decade. So, and the economy right now is a fourth of what it was when Maduro took over in 2013. So it's one fourth. It's came down by 75%. In the Great Depression, GDP came down by 29% in the US. Okay, so this is like three Great Depressions. It's so in that context, a fourth of the population left the country. If Maduro manages to create enough terror and panic to stay in power, under those circumstances, the economy will continue its implosion and people will leave. That's why Latin America and the US have a really, really vested national interest in making sure that this regime ends. Because if this regime doesn't end, they will have a new migration crisis to handle. And while 8 million people have left the country, there are 20-some million more people back there who might continue the process. That's why it's early. People are hopeful. People are protesting. But it's important that they win. It's important that they win.
Thank you very much. You've been listening to Ricardo Hausmann. He's the founder and director of Harvard's Growth Lab and the Rafik Hariri Professor of the Practice of International Political Economy at Harvard Kennedy School. Thank you, Ricardo, for your time.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for this conversation.